What do we want the future of transportation to look like? For some of us, the dream is clear. Trains, buses, and bicycles, a general shift away from the car-dominated culture that has defined America for decades, but not everyone agrees. Cars are the American way of life, and many people see public transit as either unnecessary or inconvenient. And nowhere will this divide be more apparent than with the new, yet familiar resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Donald Trump. By the time this video is live, Donald Trump has entered his second term as president, backed by a Republican-controlled Congress and a conservative-leaning Supreme Court. For some people, this is cause for celebration. For others, including transit and climate advocates, it feels like a death sentence. Now, I want to make clear this isn't about partisanship. Transit isn't an issue that should be tied to partisanship in the way that it can live or die based on who is in office. But it is undeniable that transit is political. From deciding who to serve, where to put transit lines, how to fund transit, to discussing the economic, environmental, and social effects of transit. You cannot separate politics from public transportation, and it's obvious that Donald Trump and other Republicans are mostly anti-transit, making this conversation not just interesting, but required for the next 4 years. It forces us to ask and answer some existential questions, like what does transit and transit activism look like under a second Trump administration, and what do we want the future of transportation to look like? Let's start with the near term. How much damage can an anti-transit administration actually do? On day one, not that much. Transit systems don't just stop functioning because of a new president. That's because most transit systems operating budget, around 90% in places like Boston's MBTA and Atlanta's MARTA, come from state and local governments, not federal funds. Now, this is a big deal because it creates a barrier between what Trump can do at the federal level and the everyday dealings of transit in cities across the nation. But this isn't true for every single system. Certain transit systems in places like Albany, Alabama, and Northern Virginia do heavily rely on federal funding in order to operate their everyday transit, and thus some additional solutions are going to be needed. The reality is state departments of transportation, or DOTs, hold the key to short-term transit stability. It's been well publicized that many transit systems are going through a funding crisis, and that's only going to increase for systems that do rely on federal funding. But DOTs have the power to fix that. It's entirely possible for other DOTs and state governments to allocate more money to transit through other funding sources. In Philadelphia, Governor Shapiro flexed PennDOT highway funds to SEPTA, proving that DOTs can and should play a bigger role in supporting transit's operating capabilities. I've heard a lot of transit advocates say that if you don't like your city's transit, then blame your state's DOT. More likely than not, city transit budgets can be covered using DOT funds. It just takes some political will to move the needle even a little bit towards transit away from cars. Transit systems that act now by hiring more operators, improving reliability, and increasing frequency, all while finding regular sources of funding, really can set themselves up for success regardless of who is in the White House. So the next 4 years. Trump's first term made his priorities clear. He cares about highways, cars, and deregulation. He blocked key transit initiatives like New York's Gateway Project, stalled California's high-speed rail, and most recently opposed congestion pricing in New York City. His new pick for Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, a former congressman and reality TV personality, really illuminates his current stance on transit. Duffy doesn't have a long transportation legislative history, but Trump's praise for Duffy's ability to, quote, rebuild America's highways, tunnels, bridges, and airports, and Duffy's hand-waving responses to questions about transit during his hearing say it all. Transit isn't a priority. He seems like he's really open to bipartisan cooperation, but it's very clear that he's not that transit advocate that we need in that seat in order to move this country forward. So what does this mean for funding? Well, it's complicated. Many transit agencies and projects have been scrambling the last 2 months of Biden's term to secure more funding. Examples like LA Metro's expansion, BART's expansion in San Jose, CTA's Red Line extension, and even Honolulu Transit are trying to get into this funding sources. Now, thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law passed in 2021, aka the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a lot of transit funding is already locked in. And it's kind of there to stay. That law was passed using congressional action, and thus repealing that law would take another congressional action, which surprisingly takes a monumental amount of cooperation. But what Republicans can do is delay decisions, shift priorities, and tighten the purse strings on competitive grant programs. Trump would probably love to strip the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Both contain language that support new city transit and passenger rail lines, transit-oriented development, station accessibility, and highway removal. In particular, capital improvement grants like new and small starts are under threat to be cut down, but not totally killed. These were used to fund projects like Seattle's Linwood Link Extension and the future New York City 2nd Avenue Subway Phase 2. Now, they won't be killed because nearly 75% of the $268 billion in clean energy investments is earmarked for Republican states and districts. The truth is, many red areas experience the benefits of clean transportation, and repealing these bills wholesale would be a huge loss to Republican leaders of these districts. But as stated before, the big tool that Trump has is slowing down decisions and reallocating competitive funds within the existing framework, which during his last administration cost transit agencies nearly $1 billion in funding. Maybe a funding decision is stretched out over a long period of time, or maybe the goalposts in which a project is judged upon in order to receive money is shifted. Now, these transit projects take a long time, and the amount of work in terms of engineering and planning is monumental. So any amount of delay can lead to millions and billions of dollars of overages, which for a project like the New York City 2nd Avenue subway can be a death knell. Republicans' other major calling card is the IIJA sunsetting in 2026, allowing a Republican-controlled Congress to potentially decide on the reallocation of transportation funding. The major takeaway here is that there is a lot standing in the way of Trump meddling with transportation funds for transit, especially those that are already allocated. But coming into 2026 with the IIJA sunsetting, it means that there's a lot of discussions that need to be had by transit advocates in order to be ready to really get the ball rolling with transportation. The future impact of Trump's presidency may not come from laws or budget cuts, but rather from a shift in culture. We've seen how Trump reshaped political discourse in 2016, and he has the chance to do the same thing today with public transit. By continuously discrediting transit as a waste of time and a waste of money, he risks normalizing this as an actual talking point within mainstream media. And now the way that we talk about transit shifts. It's about the culture of continuously discrediting city transit and high-speed rail, despite the reason why it's failing is because it's not getting enough funding and support. Look, Vivek is already doing it. It's about talking about how important traditional infrastructure upgrades, rural transportation, and highway construction is, and not giving a transit any airtime. It's about prioritizing public-private partnerships and deregulating private industries related to transportation, discrediting transit agencies and normalizing that transit should be run at a profit, even if it is less efficient and inequitable. It's about deciding what the future of transportation will be before we even discuss it. One of the most sobering sights in the last few weeks has been seeing companies, organizations, and people change their policies and stances on social issues like racism, environmentalism, and equity. There's been an undeniable movement towards the right over the last few years, and especially the last 2 months prior to Trump's inauguration. And it stems from a shift in culture, a normalization of conservative talking points in everyday conversations, the news, and social media. Transit is under this same threat, but instead of companies, it's state governments fearing that federal transit funds will be pulled from under them or other repercussions if they don't comply with Trump's wishes. See, the threat to transit is not around cutting funding, it's about redefining what is possible. Transit might be systematically attacked, set up for failure by not receiving any financial support, and scrutinized by conservative governments despite them being the reason it failed. If that happens, then the public, in the news, on social media, and in everyday conversations, will automatically associate transit as radical and expensive. And politicians, in turn, will focus on transit even less than they already do because they fear backlash from the Trump administration and feel a lack of support from a voter base that has turned away from public transportation. If transit advocates are always on the defensive and Donald Trump is always on the offensive against public transportation, then the conversation shifts away from trying to scrounge up some extra funding for transit and instead defending public transportation as an institution, as an idea. The American public's conversation about transit will go from how much should American cities expand transit to the starting discussion being, should we even have transit to begin with? That would be the nail in the proverbial coffin for American transit. The extinguishing of decades of goodwill that transit has built up that scares even the bluest of politicians from advocating for more transit. And that's something that we need to stop before it happens. My transit pet peeve are people who are overly defeatist about the future. But there's a certain neoliberal nihilism that comes around urbanist spaces whenever an electoral loss happens. You'll see it online, people resigning themselves to years of doomed transit, seemingly deriving joy from telling people how over public transit is in America, that there is no use fighting for better public transportation. And that is extremely weird behavior to me. Right? I've learned in my years of advocating and working in transit that you just have to fight. That just comes with the territory of being a transit advocate. And we can't be petrified of the future that is not promised yet. The next 4 years are going to be tough, and not just for transit, but it's going to be a lot worse if we just sit around and do nothing. And worst case scenario, if you convince would-be activists to just give up and do nothing because you think that electoralism is the only way to make change in this country. Simply put, it is not. American individualism has tricked us into thinking that collective action does not work. So what do we do now? Real change happens within our communities, and activists across the country prove that when people organize, transit wins. In the 2024 election, 46 out of 53 transit referendums passed. That is a mandate for public transportation. As I said before, local DOTs hold an immense amount of power when it comes to operating and funding transit, which is great news for local activists because it means that those local representatives that you have in your city council or at your state DOT board are way more accessible, way easier to reach, and way easier to sway than the federal representatives. Look at Columbus, Ohio, who approved the sales tax initiative to fund BRT. Or Maricopa County, Arizona, aka Phoenix, which voted to pay for light rail improvements. Even in Horry County, South Carolina, home of Myrtle Beach, which voted for Donald Trump at a rate of 69% to 30%, raised up to $300 million going towards mass transit. These local victories do not exist in a vacuum, but are a culmination of years of activist work. Activists like you and I who just care about cities. These transit wins set the tone of what is possible nationally. All of that is a vouch for federal legislation that supports public transportation in our cities. If you care about transit nationwide, then care about transit in your own backyard. Get painfully acquainted with your city's planning commission, with your city's comprehensive plan, with your transit agency's public meetings. Get involved with local advocacy groups. Vote and volunteer for state and federal representatives that really support public transportation. The hard truth is that you don't win people over by just being right. You do that by being empathetic and collaborative. In real life, politics is not these clean 1v1 debates. You just have to build connections and coalitions if you want to do anything. If there's one thing that the previous election should have taught us, it's that political support is not guaranteed. Look at Nashville, where transit advocates built a diverse coalition of supporters to fight for better bus transit. Their first attempt in May of 2018 lost 64% to 36%. This time around, they put a concerted effort to listen to community input, especially from the African American community that had previously been disenfranchised in the decision-making process. By garnering support from a diverse coalition of people, including business leaders, community groups, and everyday riders, they turned skeptics into allies and won, passing the referendum this time 66% to 34%. On the flip side, San Diego's Measure G failed because it didn't reach suburban voters effectively, and there being existing mistrust to the San Diego Association of Governments. And there's a learning opportunity here. We need to meet people where they are, prove that transit improves lives even in car-dependent areas, and start showing small successes to sow trust. This may seem contradictory, but it's also important for transit activists to be bold. Be ready to negotiate and collaborate, of course, but start off pushing DOTs and transit agencies to evaluate the most ideal forms of transit first. We cannot afford to have the starting point of transit discussion being half-baked rail or bus plans. This shifts transit's Overton window towards the correct direction, one where good transit is the expectation, not just the goal. Above all, you have to fight for what is right. But to do that, activists have to push beyond the basics. Public transportation isn't just a transportation issue, it's an everything issue. It affects housing, climate, equity, and the economy, and in turn, these issues affect transit. Because public transportation is a mirror to society. The issues that society faces are manifested in transit. Transit advocates cannot solely support transit, because that is an incomplete solution. Be ready to advocate for climate action, housing reform, social safety nets for people suffering through homelessness or addiction. These things all affect transit, and in turn, transit affects those issues. So we need to team up with people in those coalitions and convince them to be a part of our own advocacy as well. We have to be jacks of all trades, masters of all. The future of transportation is up to us to fight for it. But you fight for what you believe in because it is the right thing to do and not because you're already winning. The next 4 years will require transit activists to be proactive and resilient, but you'll do it because the working class, the environment, and the disenfranchised need transit. America needs transit. And in turn, transit needs somebody to champion it. So I'll ask the question one more time. What do you want the future of transportation to look like?